August 1942, Solomon Islands. General Hyakutake believed that Henderson Field would be retaken in a few days. At his map table in Rabaul, the Japanese commander saw the jungle as an ally, the night as an advantage, and the enemy as predictable. After all, from Nanking to Singapore, the Imperial Army had crushed every Western force it could find, with less supplies, less artillery, and more spirit. For Hyakutake, victory was a matter of honor, and inevitable. That conviction, fueled by 5 years of triumphs in Southeast Asia, would be crushed not by a brilliant new tactic but by something Japan never considered decisive: the power of the system. Because Guadalcanal was not a battle between men, it was a collision between doctrinal faith and industrial logistics. In this video, the viewer will see why Japanese soldiers, accustomed to fighting with endless courage and an empty stomach, faced for the first time an enemy that not only shot accurately, but that never stopped shooting. How the jungle, which seemed to be an ally, became an enemy, and why, at the end of 6 months, the terror that hung among the leaves was no longer the fear of dying, but the certainty that they were fighting in a war already lost. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story more than any map or aerial image. 36,000 Japanese troops were sent to the Guadalcanal Canal. When the evacuation began, only 10,000 remained, and of those, at least 3,000 were so weakened by starvation that they could barely walk. Most did not die under enemy fire. He died without food, without quinine, without ammunition. It died because Japan believed that courage could replace logistics. Guadalcanal wasn't just a defeat, it was a revelation. If you value the story told with data, context, and respect for the truth, consider leaving the like and subscribing to the channel. This simple gesture helps us keep alive the memory of the conflicts that shaped the world. During the years 1937 to 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army seemed unbreakable. From the invasion of China to the fall of Singapore, the formula was repeated with doctrinal precision: surprise attack, night infiltration, light movement, and absolute confidence in the spiritual strength of the Japanese soldier. In manual after manual, the message was clear: heartbeat steel. For officers trained at the Army Academy in Tokyo, war was an extension of samurai tradition, and victory was a natural consequence of sacrifice. The doctrine was taught not only as a technique but as faith. It did not matter if the enemy had more weapons, planes, or ammunition. The Japanese soldier should despise this abundance, since it only softened the spirit. That vision worked, to a certain extent. In Nanking, the Chinese were poorly organized. In the Philippines, the Americans were isolated. In Singapore, the British were unprepared. Each success reinforced the conviction: the spirit won over the structure. When intelligence reports began coming in from the South Pacific, warning of the movement of American forces on Guadalcanal, the general's response was predictable. "They have no stomach for prolonged combat," Colonel Ichiki wrote before boarding. "They are office soldiers supported by cigarettes and machines." The irony would not be long in coming, because what Ichiki and so many other officers didn't understand was that they were about to face, not soldiers, but a system. By 1942, the United States had already begun the largest industrial mobilization effort in military history. An entire nation, with 132 million inhabitants, had been redirected to produce war on a scale. While Japan was celebrating its victory over disorganized soldiers with sabers and bayonets, the United States was putting into operation 80,000 factories, 300 shipyards, and hundreds of exclusively military railroad lines. In practical terms, the Japanese fought with Arisaka bolt-action rifles produced in handmade batches. The Americans were already field testing the M1 Garand, the first standard-use semi-automatic rifle in the world, with a weekly production of 13,000 units. On Guadalcanal, this would mean a rate of fire almost double in any infantry engagement. What's more, while the Japanese soldier carried 1 grenade, the U.S. Marine could carry 6 and request as many more as he wanted, with permanent logistical support. The disparity was shocking, and until the moment of the crash, completely ignored by the Japanese command. The classical doctrine taught that excess equipment hindered the maneuver, that too much food slowed down the soldier, that radios and coordination made men dependent. The training emphasized resistance to suffering, not shooting accuracy. So when they landed on Guadalcanal, the first shock of the Japanese didn't come from bullets. It came from silence, from the absence of panic, from the enemy that waited, hidden, cold, silent, with weapons that did not jam and supply that was never lacking. In his doctrine, this was impossible, but it was just the beginning. To get an idea of what the Japanese would face, consider this fact. In 1942, the United States produced 47,000 military aircraft. Japan produced 8,161. If this statistic surprised you, comment now. Absolute power. Because this difference, in almost 6 times more, did not represent only numerical superiority. It represented time in the air, spare parts, replacement pilots, relay of mechanics, and bombing with continuity. On Guadalcanal, American planes landed and took off on a runway under construction under constant fire. Still they flew. Still, they refueled. Still, they returned the next day. Japan did not understand this logic. He did not accept that, instead of relying on the individual soldier, the United States had built a system in which each man was a replaceable part, and where the gears kept turning, even in the midst of mud, jungle, malaria. This system operated in cycles. A naval convoy was unloading food and ammunition. Trucks distributed to the trenches. Doctors collected the wounded with plasma and antibiotics. Tanks returned for maintenance. And the same gun fired in the morning was reloaded in the afternoon, with more ammunition, more lubrication, more accuracy. Japan, on the other hand, believed that it would defeat the enemy by austerity. Soldiers learned to live on a bowl of rice a day. The result? When they ran out of ammunition, they used bayonets. When the food ran out, they marched fasting. When the medicines ran out, they died. And when faith is gone, it was too late. The myth of Japanese invincibility was not destroyed by a great battle, but by small details, by working radios, by automatic rifles, by loaded trucks, by registered artillery, by planes that flew every day. Guadalcanal wasn't a place, it was a cog, and the Japanese soldier didn't know how to tackle gears. In the next part, we will see how this arrogance materialized in the figure of Colonel Ichiki, and how his doctrinal confidence led him to order one of the most disastrous attacks in Japanese military history, against a line of silent, calibrated machine guns waiting only for the warrior spirit to cross the sandbar. At dawn on August 7, 1942, the ships of the American task force began to silence their engines off Lunga Point. In absolute silence, more than 11,000 Marines from the 1st Division landed on Guadalcanal's northern coast in an operation dubbed the Watchtower, the first U.S. ground offensive of the Pacific War. The Japanese did not expect any of this. They believed that it would take the Americans years to react, that the Pacific was theirs, and at that moment, it really was. But what the Japanese commanders didn't know, or refused to admit, is that the same nation that had barely managed to defend itself at Pearl Harbor 8 months earlier was now moving entire divisions, escorted by cruisers, aircraft carriers, and bombers, to an island with no name on most civilian maps. In less than 24 hours, the Marines captured a Japanese airstrip still under construction. It was just a clearing of red earth with earthwork started by enemy engineers, but its value was incalculable. The site would be named Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, killed at Midway, and would soon become the center of gravity for the entire campaign. In the Japanese High Command, the news of the landing provoked alarm, but not respect. Early interpretations described the American act as reckless, and defensively untenable. For Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, assigned to lead the first ground response, the American operation was nothing more than bravado, a desperate gesture by an inexperienced army. Ichiki, a veteran of the campaigns in China, was respected as a doctrinaire and strategist. He had blind faith in Japanese discipline and utter contempt for what he called the industrial method of combat. When he was ordered to land on Guadalcanal, he came with only half of his regiment, 117 men, convinced that this was enough. His superiors had ordered him to wait for the rest of the troops before attacking, but Ichiki ignored the command. In the early hours of August 19th, his men set foot on the beaches of Taivu Point, just 25 kilometers east of Henderson Field. No shots were fired, no resistance was encountered. To him, this only confirmed the narrative of weakness. The Americans had fled. They were hiding. They would not resist. In his mind, The jungle protected those who were strong. But in American doctrine, the jungle was not a refuge. It was a weapon. While Ichiki organized his patrols, General Alexander Vandegrift's riflemen, aware of the enemy landing thanks to a reconnaissance patrol commanded by Captain Charles Brush, prepared defenses at the mouth of a small river called the Ilu, mistakenly named by the Americans as Tenaru. Colonel Clifton Cates organized the defensive line with geometric precision. Water-cooled M1917 machine guns were positioned with crossfire fields. 37mm anti-tank guns, with fragmentation ammunition, were calibrated for specific ranges. Barbed wire, rifle positions, mortars ready for night saturation. American doctrine did not base its defense on moral resistance, but on repeatable lethality. For each position, there was ammunition replacement. For each weapon, spare parts. For each death, a substitute. The battlefield in practice was a production line. Ichiki, ignoring patrol reports and warnings that the enemy was numerous and well-equipped, ordered a frontal assault. It was a faithful repetition of the nightly tactic that had worked against poorly armed Chinese and poorly trained Filipinos. At dawn on August 21st, his men advanced across the sandbar that separated the river from the beach, shouting banzai and lighting up the night with phosphorus grenades. In less than 5 minutes, the attack collapsed. The heavy machine guns opened fire in unison. The Japanese lines were mowed down by continuous bullets which never jammed, never ended. Those who managed to break through the curtain of fire encountered defensive grenades, bayonets, and saturation artillery at very close range. When the sun rose, more than 800 Japanese soldiers lay on the sand in shallow waters. Ichiki was found dead days later. Some say he killed himself with honor. Some claim he died trying to lead one last charge. What matters is that his regiment ceased to exist in less than a night. For the Japanese officers who analyzed the disaster, the explanation was elusive. The Americans were outnumbered. Luck favored the defenders. But one surviving sergeant wrote something that wouldn't be published until post-war. They knew we were coming, and they knew how to stop us. That was the first real shock. It wasn't just that Americans resisted. It was the fact that they waited calmly, with discipline, with reserves and constant ammunition. They fought as if they had rehearsed every step of the night before. And in fact, they had rehearsed. The battlefield for the Marines was a reverse assembly line. The end product was predictable destruction. But what the Japanese didn't know yet was that Tenaru would only be the beginning. Because just ahead, another, even more numerous Japanese unit would march to an elevated field covered with kunai grass, a place the Americans called Edson's Ridge. And there, for the second time in a few weeks, the Empire would discover that you cannot beat steel with ideology. The night of August 20th, 1942, marked the first major tactical breakdown of Japanese doctrine in the Pacific. On the banks of the Ilu River, mistakenly called Tenaru by the Americans, Colonel Ichiki's confidence was put to the test in brutal fashion. His 917 men advanced across the sandbar with discipline, bravery, and the certainty that a night attack would break through any Western defenses. The doctrine said that willpower overcame any trench. But this wasn't a trench. It was a calibrated killing zone. The instant the first soldiers appeared in the crosshairs, M1917 Browning machine guns went into action. Water-cooled with a continuous rate of fire, positioned to create crossfire ranges, they transformed the sandbar into a dead-end corridor. Every 10 meters, another weapon came into operation. On either side of the river, 81mm mortars fired bursts in short arcs, finely tuned by forward observers. The American defensive line did not depend on improvisation. It had been drawn on maps marked with stakes, recorded by coordinates, and stocked with enough ammunition for 2 nights of combat. The Japanese attack lasted for minutes. The slaughter, hours. Many were shot down before they even saw the enemy. Those who managed to cross the sandbar faced grenades, semi-automatic rifles, and bayonets with light artillery cover. In the morning, the bodies covered the riverbank. The Marines, as they surveyed the battlefield, found intact equipment. Backpacks closed, bayonets still sheathed, rifles unfired. Most died before they even had time to react. The Japanese would call that combat the Ichiki disaster. The Americans, of fire engineering victory. But the real lesson was in the unspoken words. The Japanese soldier, trained to die with honor, had been slaughtered methodically. And for the first time, The myth of invincibility trembled. Ichiki's failure was not just a defeat, it was a doctrinal divide. The frontal assault, the ultimate symbol of Japanese military honor, proved useless in the face of a defense built on spreadsheets, measurements, and constant supply. The American soldier did not wait bravely. He waited with adjusted aim, radio communication, and spare grenades. The firepower was not improvised. It was logistics, and it worked like a factory. No flaws, no breaks, no emotion. When the survivors were interrogated, few spoke, but one of them muttered something that would become commonplace in the following months. They knew where we would be. They knew what we were going to do. They were ready before us. In Japan, the impact was muted. The government did not disclose the real figures, but the officers knew. 800 killed in a single attack, without territorial advance, without disorganizing the enemy, was more than a mistake. It was a breach of logic. The jungle, which in the first days seemed to be an ally, now revealed its true face. He did not hide the Japanese, exposed them. It made them march in a straight line, along predictable trails, against positions interconnected by continuous communication and millimeter coordinates. As Ichiki crumbled, the Americans improved. At Henderson Field, Marine Corps engineers widened the runway each day. The Cactus Air Force, made up of F-4F Wildcat fighters and SBD Dauntless bombers, already made daily patrols. Each day of defense meant more ammunition unloaded, more food distributed, more wounded treated, more trenches dug. The war of the Americans was cumulative, that of the Japanese consumable. And in Tanaru, an entire battalion was consumed. What the Marines faced there was a doctrine from the past, and what the Japanese found there was the future of war. But the real test was yet to come. For as Ichiki disappeared beneath the murky waters of the Ilu River, an even larger force marched through the hills of Guadalcanal, led by another commander convinced of Japanese moral superiority. And this time, it wouldn't be a sandbar. It would be a crest, a small name with tall grass and wide vision, Edson's Ridge. The next offensive began with more care, more men, and more hope. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi landed on Guadalcanal with nearly 6,000 troops, confident that the Ichiki disaster was an accident, not a symptom. The doctrine was not wrong, they said. There was a lack of preparation, planning, knowledge of the terrain. Now, with reinforcements, intelligence, and a new night attack plan, the tide would turn. The mission was simple: capture Henderson Field from the south, infiltrating through dense jungle and climbing a ridge known to Americans as Lunga Ridge. The target was clear, but the problem was the same. The logic of Japanese doctrine did not yet recognize the dimension of the machine it faced. At the top of the crest, Major Merritt Red Mike Edson and his raiders, an elite unit of the Marines, had already deployed about 830 men. They dug shallow positions, installed light mortars, calibrated artillery with topographic maps, and placed observers with radio communication at strategic points. By the time the first Japanese scouts emerged in the vegetation, the terrain had already been mapped. Kawaguchi's attack began on the night of September 12th. It was a methodical advance, divided into wings, trying to outflank the defenders on 3 distinct axes. But even in the darkness, the deciding factor was the same. Americans saw, heard, and responded with superior weapons, constant communication, and immediate resupply. Japanese soldiers attacked with unchallenged courage, crossing open areas under crossfire, shouting banzai, often wielding only bayonets and grenades. For 2 nights, the battle swung for meters. At certain times, the Japanese caught up with the Marines' positions. Hand-to-hand combat intensified. Knives, rifle butts, point-blank shots. But with each charge, the American response reorganized. Because behind the front line were ammunition stockpiles, plasma supplies, evacuation routes for the wounded, and teams that kept rifles clean, radios operating, and grenades available. It was a living fortress, not concrete, but replacement. By dawn, the ground was covered with more than 850 Japanese bodies. The offensive had been crushed. The crest, maintained. Edson, decorated. But the real winners were invisible. The engineers who had prepared the defenses, the logisticians who had kept the men fed, the pilots who had bombed approach routes, and the radio operators who connected each piece in real time. The pattern repeated itself. Extraordinary Japanese courage, predictable tactics, absent supply, and once again, the jungle did not protect. She exposed it. He made the flanks visible, slowed the movements, silenced the shouts, and blocked the retreat. For many Japanese soldiers who survived the Edson's Ridge massacre, the question began to form, whispered, hidden, dangerous. Why do they seem to know everything beforehand? The answer was simple. Because they knew. Because the Americans' war was not reactive. It was procedural. A system of data, equipment, and answers. There was no improvisation. There was a pattern. And standard wins doctrine. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was enough to observe that the Americans won not by brute force, but by continuity. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts with depth and respect for history, show your support. Like and subscribe. It helps us keep those stories alive and revealed. And if the massacre at Edson's Ridge was a second ignored warning, what would come next would be the final confirmation. An entire campaign fought in supply cycles, where the enemy stopped to pray, and the Americans only refueled. The jungle of Guadalcanal did not roar. She rotted in silence. After the failure at Edson's Ridge, the Japanese command continued to send reinforcements, trying new routes, redesigning tactics, but without ever changing the fundamental mistake, the denial of supply as a fighting element. Each battalion arrived with fewer supplies than the previous one. The promises of refueling came with the sound of the engines of the light destroyers, the so-called Tokyo Express, which tried to drop boxes of provisions at night, under constant bombardment by American artillery and aviation based at Henderson Field. Many of these boxes fell into the sea, others were lost on the beaches, and even those that did arrive were often damaged, contaminated, or simply insufficient. The result? An army hungry, without quinine, without plasma, without energy to walk. The war, which the Japanese had hoped to wage with steel and gunpowder, was now killing them from within, by parasites, infections, and exhaustion. Lieutenant Shoji, in a confiscated letter, wrote, "We marched 3 days, fought for 3 minutes, and died in 3 hours. In practice, most did not even reach combat. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, infected ulcers, corroded bodies even before the first shot. Soldiers with more than 39 degrees of fever crawled in search of shelter. The skin of many cracked in open wounds. The constant diarrhea weakened him to the point of not standing up. Some fainted during the marches. Others simply disappeared into the jungle, swallowed up by an environment that refused to be neutral. And meanwhile, on the other end of the line, the Marines received their 3 meals a day, C, K, and D feeds with balanced calories. Chocolate, instant coffee, biscuits, cans of processed meat, matches, gauze, plasma, sterile syringes. A logistics that arrived by sea, air, and, when necessary, was dropped by parachute. Did Americans get sick? Yes, but they received treatment. They returned to the front line with medicines. They had dry uniforms, repellents, change cotton shirts. The effort of keeping a soldier on his feet was part of the planning. The Japanese effort was to survive its own doctrine. Officials asked for sacrifice in the name of the emperor, but soldiers without food do not obey. Those who are nourished obey, and the Americans were. They ate, rested, took turns. They fought in short cycles, and they won. The difference was at halftime. For every Japanese charge against enemy positions, there were 3 days of marching, with no food and with disease progressing. For each American response, it took minutes to call in artillery, reposition machine guns, or call in air support. It was a war of attrition, but only one side could wear itself out. The jungle was the same, but the effects were opposite. For the Japanese, it was a sentence. For Americans, a calculated obstacle. The contrast was most visible in the latrines. On one side, improvised trenches, covered with flies and dug between infested roots. On the other, hygienic facilities with a minimum distance from the eating area, disinfected with chemical powder. The Japanese collapse was not just bodily, it was moral. What was once called a glorious mission began to be murmured as a march to nothingness. And with each patrol launched, fewer men returned, not by ambushes, but because of fever, nausea, delirium. The Japanese soldier did not flee, he rotted. No sound, no struggle, no way out. Japanese reports show an average of 1,300 casualties per month for medical causes alone, a number higher than the losses in combat. Meanwhile, American medical losses were compensated with rotation. Planes evacuated the wounded to hospital ships, where doctors, nurses, and plasma kept rotating the force. It was like comparing a steam engine with a jet engine. Both could work, but only one adapted to the battlefield of the 20th century. And perhaps the most symbolic image of this contrast is in a recurring scene described by Marines. American patrols finding bodies of Japanese soldiers sitting in the shade of trees, dead with no visible injuries, with their eyes still open, too exhausted even to die fighting. This was the new face of terror. It was not death in combat. It was death in waiting. The uselessness of the march, the silence of the jungle, a silence that killed more than the bullets. And if that silence seemed absolute, it would soon be broken, not by gunfire but by propellers, because in the following days Guadalcanal would begin to hear another kind of sound. Engines going up, down, refueling, covering the sky with incessant patrols. And with them would come the name that would seal Japan's fate: Cactus Air Force. For the Japanese soldier, combat was a rite. From training manuals to propaganda films, war was portrayed as a direct encounter between men, where the bayonet was an extension of the soul and courage the fuel of victory. Marching, shouting, advancing under fire, and reaching the enemy with cold steel, this was the idealized image of just war. But on Guadalcanal, that ritual died before it began. The jungle, which in theory favored close combat, had been transformed by the Americans into an interdiction grid. Every meter ahead was covered by indirect fire, human sensors, and trained eyes that called the end with numerical coordinates. The soul was no longer enough. The 11th Marine Regiment, responsible for much of the fire support on Guadalcanal, operated like a tactical watch. Their 105mm howitzers weren't spread out. They were organized. Each piece received data via radio, calculated distance, adjusted the aim, and fired with cadence. The mission was simple: deny territory, break formations, kill without seeing. In each sector, forward observers, such as Lieutenant William Bragdon, infiltrated the infantry lines with binoculars and SCR 300 radios. They located groupings, intersections, clearings, and then with a dry transmission they called the fire. The answer came in minutes: a dull roar, a sequence of impacts, absolute silence. The Japanese didn't always know where it came from. It just fell. I fell before the movement. I fell at the points of probable concentration. I fell even without a view. It was mathematics. It was doctrine. It was a forecast. And this completely nullified the logic of melee. Japanese soldiers rarely got to see the enemy. The safety distance of the Americans, added to the precision of the M2 mortars of 60mm and 81mm, prevented any approach without catastrophic losses. The Japanese radios themselves, outnumbered and underpowered, could not organize coordinated counterattacks. Communication was made by messengers, flags, or shouts, useless under artillery. On more than one occasion, entire formations disintegrated before the attack began. It was not necessary to kill the man. It was enough to disorganize the group. In an analysis made after the war, Japanese General Harukichi Hyakutake admitted, "We never understood the range of American precision. Each clearing became a trap. Our every sound was followed by fire. It seemed that the soil obeyed them." This impersonality of combat was a shock to Japanese culture. The absence of direct confrontation, the anonymity of death, the power of artillery to define who lives or dies without the enemy even being seen, all this eroded morale. Instead of heroes, there were craters. Instead of war cries, shrapnel. The American war was silent until it ceased to be, and when he spoke, it was to kill in seconds. This paradigm shift also affected the most experienced. Veteran officers who had won in Manchuria and Shanghai were disoriented. Their formations broke before contact. Their night attacks broken up by flares, machine guns, and mortars. The doctrine, built on endurance and honor, was rendered useless by numbers, ammunition, and sights. And increasingly, the survivors began to realize that they were facing a war they did not understand. The irony? Japan, an island with a tradition in naval engineering, had not invested in light and flexible artillery. The Americans, on the other hand, standardized their systems. They produced more than 24,105 mm howitzers during the war. They trained teams to operate them in any climate, terrain, or continent. It was serial production, applied to the battlefield. There was no improvisation. There was repeatable accuracy. And for this reason, the American soldier did not expect the melee. He avoided him, because his mission was not to fight, it was to win. And to win, it was necessary to kill before contact. That is why so many Japanese died anonymously, without firing a shot, without completing the charge, without leaving a mark. The American artillery did not seek glory. He was looking for efficiency, and he did. In the next few days, Japanese troops would attempt something new. Outflank an impossible route, bypass positions, reach the bottom of the American line. But what they would find there was not weakness. It was weaponized logistics. And that next lesson would be given by something even more feared than artillery: tanks. With successive defeats and the methodical destruction of each ground offensive, the Japanese General Staff adopted a tactic that sounded bold, almost ingenious. At night, while Cactus Air Force planes were ashore, fast destroyers would depart Rabaul at high speed, sailing through the dark waters to Guadalcanal to land reinforcements. It was the Tokyo Express. Each mission carried between 200 and 300 soldiers. On successful nights, up to 6 ships completed the voyage. Men were tossed ashore under the cover of darkness, sometimes swimming to shore, sometimes disembarking in small boats. The problem? They arrived with little more than their uniform. Heavy weapons, ammunition in volume, food, medicine, radios, and artillery pieces. Everything was left behind. Tokyo Express functioned as a human bridge, but not as a logistical bridge. What Japan achieved was to send hungry, sick, and poorly armed soldiers, to replace starving, sick, and poorly armed soldiers. Transportation efficiency was, in practice, a trap. Each reinforcement landed without supplies was one more body to be fed, one more weapon to be divided, one more throat screaming for quinine. The American commanders watched strangely. They hoped that the Japanese would learn, but instead, the pattern has intensified. In September, more than 4,000 soldiers were sent in this way. In October, another 5,000. And in the end, for every 1,000 men who arrived, more than 300 fell ill in less than 2 weeks. The American jungle did not retreat. The ships came, the men arrived, and they died. Again. The irony? Japan had developed a highly efficient method of reinforcing defeat. They created a bridge of suffering, with technical precision and operational discipline, to ensure that the cycle of exhaustion was repeated. A Japanese officer noted in his diary, "We arrived as if we were going to liberate those who were here, but they were worse off than us." In contrast, the Americans didn't just bring reinforcements, they brought everything. A single Allied transport ship carried 1,000 troops with 3 days' worth of full ration, hundreds of boxes of ammunition, collapsible field hospitals, radios, generators, fuel, spare parts, and light tanks. For every Japanese soldier who marched with starvation, there was an American with the supply to fight 3 battles before he was even replenished. And here's a technical fact that sums up this asymmetry. The United States built more than 4,000 Liberty-class cargo ships during the war. Japan, with its limited industrial capacity, has built only 15 Taige-class transport vessels in the same period. I repeat, 4,000 against 15. If this number surprises you, write a short phrase in the comments like "logistics wins" or "absolute power." This helps us understand the impact that this type of data has on the audience, because that's what defined Guadalcanal. It wasn't bravery, it was tonnage. The Tokyo Express, which in the eyes of the General Staff seemed like a creative solution, was in practice the confession of a structural defeat. Without control of daylight airspace, the Japanese could only move in darkness. But darkness does not carry supplies. With each reinforcement sent, the line stretched, stocks were diluted, despair increased. And while the Japanese ran at night, the Americans dug in during the day. They extended Henderson's runway. They created ammunition depots. They set up mechanical workshops in the jungle. With each cycle, the Americans were stronger, and the Japanese, more numerous and weaker. Guadalcanal was turning into an asymmetric pressure field. Japan had built a direct line between Rabaul and death, but there was still one last resort that could turn the tide: an all-out naval assault. a desperate attempt to regain supremacy at sea, and with it, the chance to nip the American airbase in the bud. And this titanic effort had a name: the Battle of Cape Esperance. October brought with it more than tropical rains and sweltering humidity. It brought the promise, and the illusion, of a turning point. General Harukichi Hyakutake landed on Guadalcanal with the 2nd Infantry Division. Veterans hardened by the campaigns in China, men who had fought and won against well-armed troops at Shanghai, Hankou, Nanjing. They carried not only rifles but the weight of expectation of the entire Japanese general staff. The mission was clear: break through the American lines, destroy Henderson Field, retake the initiative in the Pacific. It was the final offensive, and it was met with what would become the standard on Guadalcanal: silence, radar, coordination, and annihilation. At the head of the American lines was Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, a name that already carried weight among the Marines, and who, after Guadalcanal, would become a legend. Their defensive line was not just a series of trenches, it was an articulated system of camouflage, M1919 machine guns linked by firing sectors, artillery previously calibrated by forward observers, and mobile patrols that monitored flanks even before they were attacked. When the Japanese offensive began on the night of October 24th, she was faced with something that was not in the textbooks: an enemy that seemed to predict every move. The Type 95 Heigo light tanks, the pride of Japanese mechanized cavalry, advanced with infantry support, but its thin armor was pierced by bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and even hand grenades launched from the treetops by camouflaged Marines. Of the 18 tanks that left, 15 were destroyed in less than 30 minutes. The infantry was advancing close behind, and met the same fate. American artillery created no-go zones, where every yard of advance was met by intermittent 105mm salvos, frag grenades, and continuous bursts of Browning 30. The fire was not chaotic. He was methodical. Each defensive section had its reload times and relay routines. When one group retreated for ammunition or reorganization, another took the position. The battle lasted 2 nights. By the end, more than 2,000 Japanese were dead. But this time the number was just the symptom. The real impact was in the fragments of paper found on the bodies: personal diaries, field orders, notes made with pencil on wet maps. In at least 5 of these documents, the American analysts found similar phrases written in different forms but with the same essence. They knew. They knew we were coming. They knew where to strike. They knew how to kill. It was the tacit acceptance that the combat had become one-sided. The war, once expected as a duel of bravery, had turned into a chess game where one side saw the entire board, and the other only his own parts. The defeat, at that moment, was no longer felt in the body. It was felt in the soul. Japanese doctrine, which despised technology as a crutch, now stumbled over its own faith. Because Americans didn't just have more guns, they had the right guns, in the right place, at the right time. Japanese terror no longer came from bullets, but from prediction, the feeling of being constantly anticipated, neutralized, prevented from fighting before even trying. And that feeling didn't come from a single brilliant commander or an inspired garrison. It came from a system, a war machine assembled with steel, maps, radios, and supplies. Guadalcanal ceased to be a battle and became a laboratory of bankruptcies, and the next test would come by sea, a desperate attempt by the Imperial Navy to turn the tide with full force. A nocturnal naval duel where Japanese logic would be pushed to the limit and broken again. The war on the ground of Guadalcanal was brutal, but the real turning point was beginning to take shape in the air. Silent, persistent, constant. When the Marines seized Henderson Field in August 1942, the airfield was little more than a muddy clearing, pockmarked by craters and hastily uprooted logs. Within weeks, it had become a functional airbase. In 2 months, a platform of supremacy. The Cactus Air Force was born there, a name derived from the island's code name in the theater of operations: Cactus. It was not a conventional force. It operated with whatever was available: F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, P-39 Airacobra interceptors. Many of these planes landed under fire, took off with emergency warnings, flew with newly arrived pilots, and even then dominated the skies. Why? Because there was an invisible gear. Airplanes don't win wars by courage. They win by logistics. The secret of the Cactus Air Force was in what didn't fly. Barrels of fuel delivered daily by protected convoys, boxes of calibrated ammunition, mechanics who dismantled engines in the jungle, radios that tracked enemy formations, spreadsheets that rotated pilots, and air patrols scheduled based on weather forecasts made by field meteorologists. It was a war airline, operating 24 hours a day. Each mission was planned with margin, reserve, Plan B, and above all, replacement. While the Japanese launched bombardments from Rabaul, more than 1,000 kilometers away, with overloaded planes and combat time less than 20 minutes over the target, the Americans took off straight from the center of the battlefield. They had more response time, more firepower, and more chances of returning alive. The Zero fighters were still superior in maneuverability, but their victories became irrelevant when there were no mechanics to fix them, not enough fuel to repeat the mission, or veteran pilots to replace the dead. Japan suffered from a problem that it could not solve with doctrine. The loss of experience was irrecoverable. Each fallen pilot was an absent instructor, a lost tactic, an hour of flight that could not be replicated. In Guadalcanal, this process accelerated. The Japanese squadrons began to operate at the limit of autonomy, with rationed fuel, low time on the island, and constant risk of not being able to return. And even when they returned, their planes landed at bases with broken coral runways, overloaded workshops, and parts that took weeks to arrive, when they arrived. Meanwhile, at Henderson, the Wildcats were changing machine gun barrels in less than 20 minutes. The Dauntless received immediate resupply to repeat attacks on the same day. What the Japanese saw from the sky was terrifying. An airfield that withstood bombing and, hours later, launched another squadron. It was not a miracle. It was organization. In a Japanese intelligence report seized in November, a naval aviation commander wrote, "We attacked at dawn. By noon they flew as if nothing had happened. The island does not bleed." That was the true nature of the conflict. Japan flew with mysticism, the desire to achieve the impossible with honor. The United States flew with graphics, and graphics win battles. By November, the Americans were already operating more than 80 aircraft at Henderson, with 3 runways in partial operation. They began to do what was unthinkable until then: hunt down Japanese bombers before they even reached the island. The interception began to take place at sea. The Japanese formations, already tired of the flight, now faced fresh fighters dozens of kilometers from the coast. Losses were increasing, morale dropped, and the conviction that spiritual strength was enough to win evaporated. If the Cactus Air Force is remembered as a tactical miracle, it is only because its operation defied Japanese expectations. But in fact, it wasn't a miracle. It was a method. It was the aerial translation of American industrial capacity. Tanks don't win without pieces. Airplanes don't fly without fuel. Men don't fight without rotation. And on Guadalcanal, every piece, every leader, every uniform came by ships, by trains, by air transport. It was like fighting an opponent who was reborn every morning, more prepared, better equipped, more efficient. And as the skies became more and more American, Japan still believed it could win by the number of bodies thrown to the front line. But this number too would begin to fail, because on Guadalcanal soil, the remaining Japanese divisions were about to face their final battle, no longer by control, but for survival. On the strategic map of the Pacific, Guadalcanal looked like just a green spot among hundreds of islands, but from October 1942, it became something much bigger, a fixed aircraft carrier, operating day and night, with the ability to interdict naval routes and project air power with clockwork regularity. Henderson Field transformed maritime warfare around her. The sea has ceased to be a space for maneuver between fleets and has become a firing range for land-based aircraft. What had previously required an aircraft carrier task group was now solved with rotating patrols of Wildcats and Dauntless bombers. The channel known as Iron Bottom Sound, named by Americans in reference to the growing number of debris at the bottom, became a predictable death zone for anyone trying to get closer. With each Japanese attempt to send reinforcements, supplies, or cover ships, the response was immediate. Planes took off with exact coordinates, found targets still dozens of miles offshore, and began coordinated attacks. Japan, which had been betting on quick attacks and night retreats, now saw its most valuable vessels, heavy cruisers like the Furitaka and the Kinugasa, destroyed by bombers operating from an island. That changed everything. The Japanese reaction time was incompatible with the constant air threat. Their ships without effective radar were located before they even knew they were being tracked. And the worst, there was no replacement to match. Veteran naval officers trained in maneuver warfare died along with their ships. Specialized sailors sank without leaving airs. Japan was losing more than steel. I lost my memory. In contrast, the United States received new destroyers, cruisers, and transport ships each week. The West Coast shipyards worked in 3 shifts. Between January 1942 and January 1943, more than 130 Fletcher-class destroyers were commissioned. For every ship lost, 3 appeared. Each commander killed, replaced by another trained in simulated scenarios. It was a war of attrition, in which only one side had a lung to take a deep breath. In November, the naval battle of Guadalcanal confirmed the turnaround. For days, American naval forces faced and defeated in successive waves Japanese attempts to land elite army and heavy artillery. It was a floating massacre. The battleship Hiei, a symbol of Japanese naval power, was damaged by crossfire and subsequently sunk by American bombers. Experienced destroyers such as the Akatsuki and the Amatsukaze were destroyed. Each sunken vessel carried with it irreplaceable men, lost fuel, and the certainty that the domain of the sea now belonged to air logistics. A Japanese naval officer captured during rescues on the southern coast declared with resignation, "They fight with islands, we fight with distance," and this distance was fatal. Japan could not maintain its supply lines. Each nautical mile won became a logistical sentence. For the army on the ground, this meant isolation. For the Navy, it meant scrapping in real time. And for Americans, it meant something unheard of: accumulated operational advantage. Every day that Guadalcanal remained in Allied hands was one more day that Henderson Field functioned as a spear stretched out over the sea. It was no longer a base, it was a weapon that would change not only the battle, but the war. And if at sea the Japanese were already retreating, what would happen when the generals themselves began to admit that the spirit doesn't feed divisions anymore? As the siege tightened and the jungle slowly devoured each Japanese line, the greatest collapse occurred not on the flanks but on convictions. The first signs came not from defections but from notes. Officers who, weeks before, spoke of glory, began to register new terms in their diaries: war of attrition, continuous supply, error of doctrine. A notepad recovered from a major of the 2nd Division read, "The enemy anticipates, maneuvers, and supplies. We just resisted." An internal report sent by courier, intercepted by the Marines, stated, "We are fighting a force that does not depend on bravery. It depends on calendar, tonnage, and statistics." It was the recognition of a war that Japan did not know and could not win, because it was not about morals. It was about systems. General Kawaguchi, in an outburst to his staff, reportedly said, "This war is no longer about men. It's about maintenance." The warrior spirit, which had been the mainstay of the Imperial Army for so many years, became a burden. Because America, which Japanese commanders called a decadent, materialistic nation, had created a way of fighting where the soldier was just a piece, replaceable, supported, sustained. American heroism was not in the bayonet. It was in the logistics manual, in the spare engine, in the part that arrived before the failure. While the Japanese improvised bandages with leaves and marched without rice, the Americans were given plasma, antibiotics, and rations with more than 3,000 calories. While a downed Zero meant a veteran pilot lost forever, a downed Wildcat generated a report, a new part, and a simulator-trained replacement. And perhaps the cruelest number is this: while Japan trained 4,000 pilots between 1941 and 1945, the United States trained more than 193,000 in the same period. I repeat, 4,000 against 193,000. If this comparison impresses you, comment below with something like shocking data or absolute power. These numbers aren't just statistics, they're sentences, and Japanese officers began to notice them. In an interrogation after the war, General Imamura declared, "We knew America was strong, but we didn't know it was infinite." Another officer, after the evacuation of Guadalcanal, wrote a confidential report in which he coined the expression that would become a silent curse among Japanese strategists: absolute dependence on American logistics. War for Japan had always been a matter of will, but on Guadalcanal this desire clashed with something that could not be fought with fervor: a logistics cycle on a continental scale. It was like trying to bleed an ocean with a bamboo blade. The perception spread slowly. In November, a captain wrote, "We have lost men, we have lost ground, but the most serious thing is that we have lost our way, because now we know, even if we win a battle, we will still lose the war." And the most impressive thing was not the collapse of the body. It was the collapse of the idea that courage beats machines, the idea that sacrifice wins tonnage, the idea that spirit wins logistics. Guadalcanal destroyed not only divisions, it destroyed doctrines. And as we will see, the few who survived this ideological confrontation did not only bring scars on their bodies, but the silence of one who saw a truth that was never taught in the military academies of Japan. The human body has limits, and those of Guadalcanal have been crossed. By the end of 1942, Japanese troops were no longer fighting for victory. They struggled not to faint. What was once pride became walking agony. Of the more than 20,000 soldiers sent after the initial landing, thousands lay in the woods, not from injuries, but from the absolute absence of nutrition. There were reports of men weighing less than 35 kilograms, with sunken eyes, skin glued to bones, hands shaking uncontrollably. On captured patrols, the Marines reported encountering soldiers who simply turned themselves in. No strength to flee, no weapons, no reaction, only empty eyes and ruined bodies. The Japanese diet had been limited to raw leaves, tree bark, bitter roots, and small insects. In more extreme cases, the consumption of earth swallowed with rainwater was observed to create the illusion of satiety. One commander reported that discipline was no longer applied with voice, but with gestures, because even speaking became an effort. War had ceased to be a confrontation of doctrines and had become a biological punishment, a process where metabolism decided who was still a man. Strength no longer came from training, nor motivation, nor bravery. It came from calories, and those calories were terminally lacking. In the Sea's diaries, passages begin to appear that do not require any comment. "We did not evacuate because we are surrounded, but because we are empty." Another wrote, "Today I ate a slug. Tomorrow maybe I'll eat my pride." There was no longer talk of victory, but of digesting pain. In contrast, Americans prepared coffee at dawn. They heated meals in cans. They ate chocolate at the end of each patrol. They received cigarettes, balanced food, vitamins, and blood plasma by air. At the height of the Japanese shortage, the Marines reported distributing gum and crackers as part of the standard supply. It was an abyss between systems, between realities, between worlds. It was no longer a question of armed forces, but of assisted metabolism. The soldiers of the Empire were biologically abandoned, while those of the United States were supported by a logistics chain that began in California and reached, in less than 2 weeks, the roots of the jungle. For every American soldier on Guadalcanal, the convoys carried an average of 2.5 tons of supplies per month. For the Japanese, this number, when it existed, did not exceed 300 kilos, and much of it was lost in the night landings of the Tokyo Express. The cruel statistic was this: on average, for every American, there was 5 times more food available. This is not a detail. It is the core of the conflict, because an army that doesn't eat, it does not think, it does not march, it does not shoot. A hungry army is a broken idea, a body that dissolves doctrine itself. General Maruyama, in a never-sent letter written in November, wrote, "They have food, so they have time. We are in a hurry, because we are empty." That's the difference between attacking and thinking. And when hunger destroys order, what is left is not the soldier. It's the spectrum. Guadalcanal was transformed into a land of Japanese specters, still in uniform, still armed, but no longer without the link that made them combatants, the minimum energy to resist. And if the body gives way before honor, what happens to the modern samurai myth? The answer would come in the form of silence, the silence of those who stopped writing, because they no longer had the strength even to register their own extinction. And while the forest swallowed these men one by one, the American machine prepared for the last phase, not just expelling, but to ensure that they never returned. On October 24, 1942, Japan made its last major bet on Guadalcanal. It was the final effort of a doctrine that still believed that the spirit could bend steel, that the bravery of one hungry man was worth more than the ammunition of 1,000 well-fed. General Harukichi Hyakutake authorized the launch of a massive offensive through the jungle, more than 5,600 men of the imperial forces, marching on soggy terrain, cutting invisible trails and carrying minimal weaponry. Many could barely walk. Still, they obeyed. It was the last chance to prove that the Japanese ideal could still beat the American machine. But it wasn't a battle. It was an execution. When the first battalions emerged from the trees, they found what no Imperial Army manual predicted: a defense that didn't sleep, artillery that never ran out of ammunition, and a response system that needed no heroism, only calculation. The Americans already knew where the Japanese would attack. They were positioned in layers with interconnected firing ranges, calibrated mortars, and radios distributed in each infantry group. In front of the defense, an already legendary name: Chesty Puller. His men did not shout. They did not advance. Expected. The attack began at night, as Japanese doctrine dictated. But the doctrine does not protect against explosives. In less than 3 hours, hundreds of bodies littered the ground. Many were not even able to fire their weapons. Those advancing on the sides were caught by flank machine guns. Those who took shelter were located by mortars. And those who surrendered when they could, looked with sunken eyes at something they did not understand. An enemy who did not celebrate, did not shout, did not hate. It just did. The next morning, an American officer declared, "We didn't win because we shot better. We won because we were ready." In the Japanese accounts recovered after the withdrawal, there is a constant sense of incredulity, not because they lost, but because they did not even reach the enemy. One soldier wrote, "The forest breathed fire, the sky breathed fire, the earth trembled, but we didn't see who was fighting." It was the end of the myth of the duel, of direct combat, of the chance to reverse with effort. War had become impersonal, automated, ruthless. It was not a failure of courage. It was the collapse of a model, because this attack, like previous ones, was not irrational. It was consistent with everything Japan believed. But the problem was precisely this: Japan believed in something that no longer existed. The battlefield of the 20th century was no longer the stage of honor. It was the production board. For each attack, the Americans had charts. For each attack, they had stocks. And for each loss, they had replacement. Meanwhile, the Japanese couldn't even bury their dead, because there were no shovels. And the bodies rotted at the edge of the trenches, as a brutal reminder that the human will does not win if there is no protein in the blood and gunpowder in the belt. This final offensive, which was supposed to be a cry for redemption, became a military epitaph. The endpoint not of the struggle, but of the illusion. An American major, observing the wreckage at the end of the fighting, said, "They fought like ghosts. We win with tools." And the question that began to arise among the Japanese survivors was simple, painful, and impossible to ignore. What remains of a military doctrine when it doesn't even work to keep the man alive until the end of the mission? The answer would come in the form of an order, one that no samurai would expect to receive. Defeat did not arrive on Guadalcanal with a white flag, nor with a speech. She arrived quietly, sealed by a sealed envelope in Rabaul, and delivered by a night messenger. In early December 1942, after weeks of alarming reports of irrecoverable losses, uncontrollable starvation, malaria outbreaks, and successive tactical failures, the Japanese High Command accepted the unthinkable. Guadalcanal was lost, not for lack of courage, but for logistical infeasibility. The Imperial Army, which until then had regarded every retreat as cowardice, every retreat as dishonor, now authorized the evacuation. But even this term was avoided in the documents. They called it operational reorganization, because Japan wouldn't admit defeat. But at that moment there was nothing left to keep. The final report, sent in confidence, detailed that more than 10,000 men were still on the island. Most of them are terminally ill. Many could not walk. Some had to be carried by companions or left behind, already unconscious, with their features deformed by dysentery and extreme malnutrition. There was no parade, nor official communication to the public. The evacuation was carried out between January and February 1943, on 3 nights of absolute darkness, with destroyers taking extreme risk to remove what was left of the troops. There was no celebration, only the creaking of improvised stretchers and the silence of those who survived to remember what could not be said. One of the officers in charge of the operation wrote, "We did not rescue soldiers. We rescue erased voices." And yet, what most haunted the rescued was not the defeat. It was the fact that it had been predicted. They understood from seeing the American ships taking turns with precision, from hearing the constant roar of the aviation over Henderson Field, that they were fighting against a schedule, not an army. And the irony of this story is that the solution was before them from day one. It was logistics. If you're enjoying unraveling these hidden layers of war, show your support, like and subscribe. This simple gesture allows us to continue bringing out the details that rarely enter the books. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield. It was a mirror, and what Japan saw in him was a reflection impossible to deny. A war where honor was not enough. A war where the final silence said more than any cry of banzai. But what would the Americans do with this victory? The answer begins with one name, General Alexander Patch. It's a countdown. The operation was named K, a simple letter. But in Imperial Japan, it carried an almost unspeakable weight. It meant going out, remove, abandon. In the early days of 1943, as the Americans reinforced positions and consolidated their ammunition depots with near-industrial precision, the Japanese Navy was preparing in absolute secrecy one of the most daring and silent extraction maneuvers of the entire war in the Pacific. And ironically, it was a resounding technical success. In just 3 nights, February 1st, 4, and 7, the Japanese destroyers were able to extract nearly all the survivors that could still be moved. More than 10,000 men rescued under the nose of American aviation, using camouflage tactics, absolute silence, and precision night navigation. No extraction ships were sunk. No mission was aborted. The operation was so efficient that it surprised even the Americans, who only discovered the total emptying of the island days later, when they found abandoned positions and empty trenches, still smoking the remains of fires. But what seemed like a tactical victory was actually the final milestone of a strategic defeat. Japan executed to perfection the evacuation of exhausted, skeletal, unrecoverable soldiers. Men who, when they arrived in Rabaul, could no longer fight. And worse, they could not be replaced. Because Japan, unlike the United States, did not have a system of training, transportation, and human recomposition on an industrial scale. Each officer lost was irreplaceable. Each experienced sailor was a final piece. General Patch, the newly appointed American commander of the island, wrote in his diary, "It was a brilliant operation, but all they achieved was to save the bodies of a dead idea." And that sentence summed up the Japanese military tragedy on Guadalcanal, an impeccable logistical effort in the service of an utter doctrinal failure. There were no more supplies, no tanks, no veteran pilots, no safe routes. The Imperial Navy had lost not only ships, it had lost the initiative. And now, he was starting to lose the narrative. Because the Japanese retreat was not reported to the people as a defeat. It was omitted, hidden under vague communiques of tactical reorientation. But those who returned from the jungle knew what had happened, and the letters from the surviving officers always carry the same tone. Silence. The silence of those who saw the defeat consolidated not in the field, but in the map of production, in the sound of the American propellers that never stopped, in the ships that arrived like clockwork. A perfect evacuation. That was not good for starting over, just to delay the inevitable. In Washington, a young Army colonel analyzed the Guadalcanal reports and wrote a remark that ended the cycle with surgical precision. They knew how to withdraw. We knew how to replace. And that difference would define what would come next, an American offensive that would not retreat any further. Because after Guadalcanal, Japan would learn that modern warfare does not forgive blind faith, and the United States was just warming up its engines. They returned in silence. On dark barges, crowded ships, corridors muffled by moans and fevers that did not cease. Guadalcanal evacuees arrived at Rabaul and other bases in the Pacific as walking ghosts. Many had lost half their body weight, his eyes sunken, his skin glued to his bones, his feet raw. But what drew the most attention was not the body. It was the absence of speech. The silence was not just trauma. It was embarrassment, because these men did not come back as heroes. They returned as survivors of something that Japan was not ready to explain. Officially, Operation K had been a success, but in the makeshift barracks, in the field hospitals, and in the medical triage centers, the truth screamed loudly. They had lost, and they lost in a way that their doctrine never prepared. A quartermaster officer reported that many withdrawn soldiers refused food, not for lack of appetite, but for guilt. A veteran sergeant from China cried when he saw hot rice. His body reacted with spasms. Another, in feverish delirium, begged not to return to the island of invisible death. The Pacific War for these men was no longer a campaign. It was a hole without language. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the U.S. Marines who fought on Guadalcanal received medals, new uniforms, and were highlighted as symbols of the turning point in the Pacific. Many went on to train new recruits. Others returned to the U.S. on propaganda tours, and some were immortalized in newspapers as faces of the resistance. But even among them, there were traces that did not fade. Chronic insomnia, nervous outbursts, repulsion to tropical sounds. But the difference was in the surroundings. In the U.S., there were psychologists, hospitals, rehabilitation plans. In Japan, there was only silence. Silence and shame, because the Japanese soldier had been trained to die. Living, and worse, living after retreating, was not part of the doctrine. The unthinkable materialized in a cruel paradox. Those who had carried out orders and survived were now condemned to symbolic ostracism. They could not be proud of what they saw, not to talk about what they felt. Lieutenant Toshio, in a letter never sent to his wife, wrote, "The Americans knew everything, where we stepped, where we rested, when we attacked. It was like fighting against time, not against men." A Japanese psychiatrist who saw a group of evacuees months later reported that almost all of them described the same nightmare, the feeling of being trapped in an English-speaking jungle, because the Guadalcanal forest for them was no longer a natural environment. It was a living American machine, where the wind carried ammunition, mud hid communication wires, and the trees seemed to inform the enemy of every step. This internalization of material failure as a spiritual trauma would mark the Japanese post-war period in a profound way, not just in mental health statistics, but in the complete reshaping of national military identity. Guadalcanal was not just a defeat. It was a mirror where Japan saw that its army was fighting for a vision of war that no longer existed. In contrast, the American veteran, even wounded, was recycled, treaty, re-equipped, promoted. He was part of a system. It wasn't his courage that mattered, but his continuity. American industry and doctrine valued the soldier as part of a cog, not as an isolated symbol of honor. And so every American fighter on Guadalcanal came back with something: reinforcement, reconnaissance, or replacement. The Japanese, on the other hand, came back with nothing, except the knowledge that everything they believed about war was wrong. In 1944, a former Guadalcanal officer wrote anonymously to a military newspaper, "We lost before we fought, because we fought with will. They struggled with warehouses." This sentence was censored, but not forgotten, because among the returnees, it circulated like a whisper. The first admission, not yet public, that Japan, with all its history and glory, had been surpassed by spreadsheets, radios, and cargo ships. And for many, this truth was more unbearable than hunger. Guadalcanal planted a bitter seed in the hearts that returned, and it would germinate on the following battlefields, where Japan would no longer advance in faith, but with resignation. But what did Americans learn from this quiet victory? The answer would come clearly, directly, and relentlessly. The lesson of Guadalcanal does not rest on maps or casualty figures. It lives in the bowels of modern military thought, because there, in the damp mud of the jungle and in the constant hum of Allied planes, it has been proven that bravery is only the gateway, and that those who win wars are not those who fight the most, but who supplies better. Japanese doctrine was based on morals, aggressiveness, offensive spirit, and sacrifice. But those pillars collapsed in the face of a system that turned food cans, spare parts, human plasma, and ammunition into tactical forces as decisive as tanks. The Americans didn't just land troops, they landed a philosophy that the battlefield is an extension of the factory, that soldiers die but systems work, On Guadalcanal, each bomber that flew over Henderson Field was part of a logistics chain that started on the tracks of Kansas, passed through ports in California, and crossed oceans in protected convoys. It was a war where a simple communication cable, protected by a portable radio and a network of observers, was worth more than 100 bayonets, where doctors saved men who returned to fight in days, while the enemy, without quinine, rotted in silence. War has gone from being a duel of bravery to becoming a game of maintenance. This was evident when the Japanese realized that their veteran pilots were being shot down and could not be replaced, while the Americans were training hundreds of new aviators a month. Breaking an Allied plane was nothing. Soon another one appeared from the same assembly line, with the same instruments, the same ammunition, and a new pilot with the same standardized training. Marines on the ground relied on supply lines that even included razors, toilet paper, and cigarettes, because keeping a man clean and fed was seen as part of combat performance. Meanwhile, the Japanese struggled with rotting uniforms and diets of fermented rice. Americans understood that morale doesn't come from the flag. It comes from confidence in the next resupply. It was also on Guadalcanal that air warfare revealed its new nature, not as a strike mission, but as an extension of territorial control. The Cactus Air Force didn't need to win every fight. It just needed to fly. Their mere presence forced the Japanese to move at night, to carry less, to disperse troops, and to improvise. Each American flight forced Japan to make more mistakes, because in the industrial game, error is not a moral failure. It is a statistic. And America, unlike Japan, had room for error. Guadalcanal showed that modern warfare is won by redundancy. It is not the bullet that hits. It is the certainty that there will be another, and another, and another after it. So by the end of the campaign, the United States had not only held the island, they had rewritten the fighting formula. And this formula would be replicated on the following islands with even more precision: pre-established artillery, weather maps, embarked doctors, reverse engineering of radars, rotation of troops with a logistical schedule. Everything controlled, standardized, foreseen. Japanese courage remained. But now she was struggling with schedules, countermetrics, against replenishment tables. Bravery could not compete with production shifts. And that is why Guadalcanal should be read not as a victory of one army over another, but as the collapse of an idea in the face of the efficiency of a system. Because there, in the midst of the humid forest and the minefields of mud and blood, a new military axiom was established. Who does not control the supply? It does not control the war. America didn't win because they were lucky. It won because it had logistics, maintenance, and industry. And so, the next chapter of this story will not be told by isolated heroes but by convoys, spreadsheets, and ships that never failed to arrive. Because the war, the real one, does not end in the cry of attack. It ends at the sound of the next ammo box being opened. Guadalcanal was more than an American victory. It was the silent sentence of a model of warfare that no longer had a place in the 20th century. They carried frail bones, hungry bodies, and the devastating awareness that they had fought with impeccable courage, for a cause already annulled by reality. The doctrine of the warrior spirit, the bayonet, the night attack, and the contempt for logistics collapsed in the face of an enemy who needed not to run, only to refuel. The war that Japan was trying to fight was made up of myth, discipline, and sacrifice. The one that the United States imposed was made up of engineering, supplies, meteorology, and infinite reserves. And this war was already decided in the factories long before the soldiers stepped into the mud. The lesson is simple, brutal, and definitive. You cannot overcome by willpower. You win by the force of the system. Logistics determines the strategy. Maintenance defines the duration. Supply shapes morale. And when one army fights another, but it depends on luck to eat, he has already lost. Guadalcanal exposed this in a cruel way. There, soldiers died not because of a tactical error, but because of a doctrinal error. Because no one survives hunger, and no one beats time. General Kawaguchi wrote in his memoirs, "We were not defeated by courage. We were defeated by cans of food." This is the bitterest of truths. And if you believe that the story needs to be told with precision, courage, and respect, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the fuel that keeps these stories alive. Comment below on the most shocking data you discovered in this episode, And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact we're preparing. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.